Welcome to today's Politics and Tactics. We got a great show for you. We have Dave Lenart, who's going to be talking about the volunteer command post, and I'm going to probably mispronounce his name at least 6 times today, but we have Creston here from the Phoenix Fire Department and also owner of Fire Wipes. We're going to talk a little bit about rehab and cancer prevention, and we're going to kind of mix the topics together, and I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, the great P.J. Norwood, and let's start it off.
Thanks, Frank. I got to chuckle a little bit there to talk about a little about rehab, and we're less than a week out from FDIC. That some people are probably feeling that they need another form of rehab right now after a good, fun, and exciting week in Indianapolis. It was great to see you. Great to see Creston take some amazing classes from some of the absolute best instructors that the United States and the International Fire Service offers. So it was a great week, and just a little housekeeping. FDIC 2025, it seems unreal that we're already discussing it. Call for presentations is already out with a mid to late June deadline on getting those submissions in. So if you participated this year, I'd encourage you to try to participate again next year. If you haven't yet participated, now's the time. Now's the time to start working on that call for presenters, start working on some articles, start working on getting on some podcasts and sharing your message. And hopefully you can all join us next year as instructors at the absolute best fire department conference in the world, FDIC. So Frank, yeah, as you said, we got some great, guests today. Dave Lenart. Dave's been involved in emergency service since 1995. He was formerly the chief of the Derby, Connecticut Fire Department. He's currently a lieutenant in the city of Bridgeport, Connecticut Fire Department, where he's assigned to the Heavy Rescue Company. He also has some previous fire chief experience in Storm Engine Company, which is another different volunteer department in Connecticut. He's certified the IFF Fireground Survival Instructor, multiple assignments, and he can discuss some of that. He's well-versed to talk about the command post today. Then we have Creston, different part of the world. Creston started his fire service career in Arizona in 2002 in Rural Metro Fire Department. In 2005, he was hired by the Phoenix Fire Department, where he currently holds the rank of captain. He's part of their peer support team, technical rescue team, hazmat team. He's also a rescue tech specialist with Arizona TF1. He's an instructor in many different divisions and programs within his department, as well as he's an FDIC and HOT instructor. Had the pleasure of having an opportunity to meet Creston many years ago when we first started teaching hands-on program at FDIC. He's a great friend of the fire service. He really gives back in many, many ways. So excited to have them both here today. Some other Connecticut talent as well as Creston from Phoenix. So it should be a great conversation. Definitely talking about something that I'm passionate about and I really care about. We start considering, cancer, firefighter cancer. And I think I'd be remiss for Frank, you and I, not to mention our good friend who we dearly missed last week, especially at FDIC, Chris Pepler. Not saying that if we had, wipes and decon that he would still be here. However, I would have loved to have the option or for him to participate and be involved in all the things that we're doing today. And maybe he would still have been at FDIC with us last week. So we're going to bring Creston in first. Let's chat a little bit, Creston, right? So we've had some conversations about firefighter decon over the last many years. And recently, this past week at FDIC, you brought a interesting topic to the table surrounding that firefighter decon piece that you are looking to speak more about. So we invited you on the show. So what's your thoughts and where are you thinking on going with your conversation and your messaging today?
Well, I think one of the topics that I've been talking about regularly in our presentations and at some of these hot classes is just, honestly, I've dubbed it the decon dominoes. And really, it's a simplistic idea that we are approaching decon with that before, during, and after event. I'm a big fan when we have an idea that is either challenging or maybe even controversial in the house. I like to start with the conversation of something we can agree on so we can move through the conversation that is new and or challenging. So for example, when we talk about the decon dominoes, I relate that to the way the fire service is built. We have the prevention divisions. We put a lot of time and energy into that. The best fire we ever have is the one that we prevent. I think that's agreeable by all people. Then we have our operations, the way we train, our SOPs, our policies, the equipment we use, and how we operate on the fire ground, and that is fantastic. And then afterwards, we have our incident reviews, our hot washes. We have the kitchen table. We their stories, and all these things that we constantly are doing to review and revise either our history or these events. And most people are very much in tune on that. When it comes to decon, to me, that's no different. Is that if we're talking preventative measures, what is the expectation of the department? What are the policies or procedures that we can put into place? How do we support those things? How are they sustainable? Are they easily communicated? And honestly, how are they easily duplicated? Because we do this from structure fires, car fires, trash fires, all the way up through hazmat. And then through that, and then what are the equipment that we have or ideas that can be utilized on scene? What are common sense approaches to that? Because some folks either want an all or nothing type event. And to me, that's really the wrong way. We can always chip away, just like if you had limited staffing or things, you would look at your critical fireground factors and just start knocking them off one by one for your objectives. And then afterwards is just having good behavior and strong leadership. Is during the event itself, it's dynamic. It's challenging. Depending on what's on fire, obviously, is it a inside of a building, structure, residential, commercial? All these things create different hazards. But having that organizational standard and strong leadership to tell people like, hey, wipe down, use the wet decon, bag up your gear, doing the things that are in place, which really come from the preventative part. I think the aftermath is really having strong education. How do we document these things, whether it's Enforce or any of the other, charting things that are out there to keep track of these for our folks? I myself have been keeping my exposure report since I got on the job, way before cancer was the conversation, but because I had a senior firefighter that told me, hey, keep these just in case. So when we have folks that help us understand the long game, our senior members that are helping our young members that feel invincible, that have never gotten hurt, that never had ceiling drop on their head, or, I went through a really terrible ankle injury a few years ago, and it really just put things in perspective for we're not Superman, even though I felt like that in my mind. And I think when we can share those things, like the loss of a friend is generationally, when you're going through the job, the guys you're coming on all with are young and strong and energetic. And then you start developing those relationships. And eventually you get folks that get injured or sick. And then you have mentors that have retired, and then you find out they get sick. And I think that puts things through a perspective. So there's that, 5 to 10 year window where you're not really aware of the choices you're making in the long game and who that's going to affect, not only yourself, the department, the union, your families. There's, again, back to the dominoes, all these things that are affected downstream. So us to make good decisions on the front end, and the faster we can educate people and support those in their career, I think the better off we are.
All right. I think that's about it. That was great. Covered it from A to Z.
Sorry.
No, that was great. How it was, Frank and I don't mind sitting back and just letting our guests talk. And I think that was great. We love that. And a lot of what you mentioned are things that we've talked about over the years, not just this past week, but we start looking at firefighter decon. One thing that we clearly identify, Dave and myself and Frank live in New England, right? So our decon and our ability to do decon is inherently going to be different than how often or how you can perform decon in Phoenix, just because of weather, right? Our end goal is the same, right? The end goal is to decrease our risk as best that we can, because we're not going to decrease every risk. It's just not possible in this business. But having ways to decrease that risk and knowing all of the options and all of the different abilities between wet decon, dry decon, wipes, knowing when to use them and how to use them is really, really important, so that, listen, if it's a beautiful spring day like today in Connecticut, great, we can do decon if we're doing it right. But 3 months ago, in the middle of the winter, we may not be able to do wet decon. So what's the avenue for us to decrease the risk of our membership at that moment? So those are some of the challenges I'd like to get your input from, but also pass it off to Frank to get, his input, and Dave's, they come from cities, bigger departments, that the mentality sometimes is a little bit different on the priorities because of, keyword that you said, leadership. Right? So I think educating them, and me working at my level now at the academy level, making sure we're educating them when they enter the fire service, so we don't have these problems later in their career. Frank?
PJ, I can't agree more. And, I'll start with the leadership component of it. It's just like when you're a boss, David, this in Bridgeport, if you're the lieutenant and you take off your mask, your entire crew's taking off their mask. I don't care what the meter says. So, be a good leader. And if you're a boss, remember that the decision you make for yourself, you're actually making it for the men and women that are with you. So wear the mask a little bit longer. on the wet decon, I do have a significant issue with this, and it brings in the political component. We have to remember that wet gear lacks thermal stability. So we don't want firefighters soaking their gear and then going to another alarm immediately. And that's why it's so critical, whether you're a career fire department or volunteer fire department, to advocate for that second set of gear. Because if we have that second set of gear, you can do the wet decon, you can wash your gear, you can make sure you take a shower, you use wipes, use all of the components, anything you can do to limit the potential exposure. And, you know, we talk a lot about Diane Cotter, but also limit the exposure of just wearing your gear all the time, like firefighters tend to do. But that's one of my issues with wet gear, is that we really need to advocate that all firefighters have that second set of gear so we can properly decontaminate. Dave?
Yeah, you know, and on our side, being a smaller volunteer town, that second set of gear is a very difficult goal to obtain. I mean, obviously, fortunately, smaller volunteer towns, we're not going from fire to fire, and it's happened, like, I think twice in the entire time that I've been in Derby, where we've gone from a fire to a fire. But we don't have the funding, and we don't have the ability to justify that second set of gear, unfortunately, in the eyes of the town fathers. I mean, we just went through an OSHA investigation because of the overwhelming majority of our frontline turnout gear hit its 10-year limit. It's just, a lot of it is funding kind of attached to that side of the equation, where some of the smaller departments don't have the ability to do it. Everyone would love to do it, but how do you overcome that when you just can't buy the gear?
You know, and I agree that sorry, Creston, I'll get you in one second. And I completely agree that we need to advocate for those two sets of gear. That's a no-brainer, but it is a difficult thing for many departments. But Frank, I think the wording that you're using is where I disagree with wet decon and the wording and how some frame it. We can perform wet decon without soaking the gear or decreasing the thermal protection of that PPE, right? We don't have to soak down gear, and it's a light mist of water and soap it's a gross decon, right? We're not looking to soak that gear. And if we are soaking gear during wet decon, we're doing it wrong. So that comes back to something else that Creston said earlier, is an educational piece, right? So now we all know we should be using wipes, right? But is there a specific way we should be using those wipes to have them maximize benefit to us? What's the right way to...
PJ, I've worked in a city. You give somebody a hose or even a spray can, you're getting stoked. These guys and girls are blockheads. So, you know, I mean, you could try. Education is key, but generally you're going to end up, nobody wants to wear wet gear. And I think that, you know, I'll disagree with David a little bit here, is that, hey, you got to keep pushing for it. And I've seen Derby Fire Department do some great things, be on the forefront of, you know, truss markings for buildings and things like that. It's a lot of times comes down to political will and priorities. And yeah, sometimes it takes time, but at least put that plan going forward of the goal is to get two sets of gear to be dry. So we can avoid that. Cause I think, PJ, you'd agree. Ideally, we want the gear washed after a fire, right? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
That
100%. And you know, the other thing, I think that some departments feel that they have to have a complete second set of gear for every member. That's ideal, right? But what if you can think a little bit different, and let's buy 20 sets of spear gear, and then let's have a varying group of sizing. Yeah, it may not fit you perfect for that 24 hours while your primary set is being washed and dried, but there's ways to start to get to where we need to. Because yes, Frank, the gear should be bagged at the scene, brought back to the firehouse, cleaned properly, inspected, and put back into service, right? Wet decon, bag it, cleaned appropriately. But the due membership does need something else to wear during that time. So can your agency have maybe 20 sets or 30 sets of varying sizes PPE? So for that short time frame, they have something to wear to protect themselves so they can respond to within their community. Creston?
So I would say, you know, just like when the research comes out on fire behavior and tactics, it is really up to each and every one of these departments to tailor that. It's utilizing the information and then tailoring it how it's going to work for your area. I live 30 miles from the sun in Phoenix. Great. But for us, rehab is such a different situation when it comes to the heat the majority of our year. So we have challenges that meet us. When it comes to the second set of gear, I'll tell you the conversation that I think is also understanding what people are saying. Us in the city of Phoenix are very blessed. I have an entire second set of gear. That's boots, gloves, mask, helmet, hood, an entire set. So when we're talking about pants and coats and other things, there are parts of that conversation that later down the road, we should wrap our arms around it to have a better understanding. I've also heard of departments utilizing their risk management through the department, the city that they work for in townships, because what is the ROI? If you prevent one firefighter cancer, what is that number? So they've been able to look at the cost and do a cost analysis, and they've actually been able to get funding utilizing that kind of tactic, that if we can prevent one, what is that number? So there's been options for that. I do think that when you look at the percentages, that the wet decon is 85%, dry decon I think was quoted at 23%. So what is the risk management of that? And I will tell you, I think with the way that we're doing hose line management, flowing and going, pushing down hallways, I come out just as actually more of a saturated from trainings and types of fires that I go on than the decon itself. Now, does that take personal discipline on how we're utilizing those hose lines? Absolutely. But we're also learning that we're not supposed to use fire hoses because the high pressure actually embeds those things into the fibers. So are there other options out there? There are products that are on the market, things like obviously using the garden hose options. Great. There's stand-up showers that have been that have been repurposed from hazmat. There's the storm stick that mounts on the truck. There's actually no one is operating besides the firefighter self in a quarter-turn ball valve. So that limits the exposure for that engineer or the person who's not wearing PPE or an SCBA. So I think that when we look at cost of things, which is important, and absolutely money helps run all these things, but what is the exposure down the road? How long is the longevity of this item going to matter? And I think that's super important for us to look at. And when you talk about the training, we have 1,800 members, and I absolutely believe that. But, you know, for me, I always talk about the 25%. If I get 1 out of 4 people on the crew to remember the training, to be able to enforce that, hopefully it's the company officer. Because now when we're on fires and I'm wearing my mask and I turn around and I see a member not wearing theirs, all I do is tap on mine. I don't say a word, and they put it back on. And inherently, when we get back to the station, 30 minutes to an hour later, they come by and go, Skip, I'm real sorry. Hey, man, I'll be better. And I tell them, it's not just enforcing the policy and what is at risk, it's who at risk. And the members on my truck, I look at them, their wives, their children, they're downstream of their family and friends. And when we start looking about not only what is at risk for ourselves, because as a young person, I just thought, hey, man, no big deal. It would just be me and people would miss me. But as you grow longer in the tooth, people develop families, their networks, their friends, whoever that may be, you will be missed and you will affect that. And I just tell people with honesty, like, if you get sick or hurt, I will come help you. I will drive you to those appointments. I will help paint your house. I'll take your kids to school. I'll mow your yard. But you know what? I'd rather not. I'd rather you be happy and healthy and do it yourself. And I think when we have those kinds of moments to deliver a little bit of truth with the policy, it helps wash it down in a way that is remembered instead of just because how many policies do we have in departments that guys don't follow already? If you're having to argue about putting on a vest to back a truck, if you're having to argue with folks, whatever it is, sometimes we have to have these gentle nudges and reminders, So to me, with a little bit of truth, it really helps attach in a different way.
Frank?
Creston, you mentioned that community put together some data. Is that available, or is that going to be your next article for fire engineering that we would love to publish? Because if we can get data, especially when it comes from the city hall side of it, it can really help other fire departments, even if it's an order of magnitude and it's not like here and here, but at least it gives us a starting place. Is that something that you're going to be writing for fire engineering in the next coming weeks?
I think that's a great softball. Thank you. So we've done some projects through Arizona State. Chief Case was with our department for a long time, and we always looked at what was lost, the numbers lost in these cities. Arizona State came out with this project that was what was saved. What was the community impact for the fire department? So what you're paying for and what you're getting versus what you're paying for and what is lost. We always had these loss statements come in from what was lost for these structures or community impact. Well, kind of flipping the script on that. Well, you're right. There will be a loss because there was a fire, and it started before we were even dispatched. But what happens when we get there? And I think looking at that, just like the money that is looked at from fire prevention, should be the same lens we're looking for in cancer prevention. For us, a median, policy is like a BLS engineer non-certed is our median pay. So if you look at 1 year of that person being off and 1 year of overtime it takes to fill that person's number, that's an easy, non-negotiable, very easy, not, you can't argue it. That if someone was off, whether that's an injury to their back or for cancer. Now you get into the treatments and the long-term injuries and industrial type things. I think I absolutely think that's a probably great idea to develop an algorithm and an outline to help people try to help navigate that, whether that's their city, township, whatever it may be, to have those conversations, because you are asking for money outside the box, but the preventative on the other side is so big, and not even just to the person, because that is subjective to the numbers, but actually their impact to their cost overall. And that's the data you can't argue.
No, I think that's very important. And when it comes to data, we need to do a much better job of capturing that data. And you were talking about loss versus saved. It's amazing how many departments. I just had a full workshop at FDIC, and I asked, how many fire departments here are tracking property saved? And most of the fire departments in the room aren't. And the issue is, if you can track property saved, that's what you use for your budget justification and grant justification when you want to get decon equipment, when you want to get a second set of gear, when you want to get that washer and dryer in each firehouse. You need numbers to go to City Hall. And, somebody asked, said, well, it's kind of complicated. I go, no, it's not. If you have a food on the stove call where you did $300 worth of damage, you can just go on Zillow, and then what's that house worth subtracted from the $300, and right there in 30 seconds you have a rough estimate of property saved. And if you do that by the end of the year, and David's brother works in Greenwich, and I know Greenwich doesn't even do this. I mean, it's the Republican ghetto. They're all millionaires in big, huge mansions, and when they stop a small fire, they don't even track religiously property saved. But that number could be so critical for budget justification and grant justification. PJ?
Yeah, Frank, I couldn't agree more with the conversation, and what keeps coming back at me to make sure that I bring up this conversation, is think about the keynote session day 2 of FDIC this year. And if you haven't seen that, I'm sure Mark Hall, who makes us look good and runs this show in the background for us, will put that link up. And you look at the words of editor-in-chief David Rhodes and Mike Champo, who we all know writes the back page, and what they have both gone through in the past year, and what David Rhodes has gone through doesn't even compare to what Mike Champo has. But it impacts each one of us differently. And when you start talking about your mask, and you see Mike Champo standing up on that stage holding his mask for his radiation treatments, it kind of hits home. It hits home. And what Creston said at the beginning, that it just doesn't affect you. It affects our families. It affects that domino effect. I'm the spouse of a cancer survivor. I sat with my wife as she went through 2 rounds of chemo, went through radiation. It impacts your family significantly. And I know that because I've been the one that has been impacted on that other side, right? So there is that domino effect. And when we start hearing, like Creston said, and I like the way he said it much better than I did, start hearing those truths embedded with the education, I think that's what we need to really consider, on looking at firefighter decon, on what we can do each day to reduce our risk. Again, we're not going to eliminate it, but reduce our risks through all of these things that we're discussing today. And putting a number on it and getting that data is great. And Creston, if you're thinking about that article, I have a risk management friend who works for an extremely large insurance company here in Connecticut that insures many municipalities across the state. I'd love to pair you up with to get that risk management piece coupled with your fireground stuff and your decon stuff. I think you guys can make a great article.
No, that would be a great idea.
PJ, one thing that has always fascinated me is the way the free market operates. And, now with Forever Chemicals, we now have gear coming out that's going to have no PFAS in it. Creston, you were at the forefront of this with the firefighter wipes, right? You saw a need and you were innovative. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think that's an important story to tell, because you were also like Diane Cotter, you were ahead of the curve of saying, hey, here's a problem. Let's come up with a solution, bring it to market, and help firefighters. And I think you should be commended for that, because we need more of that free market innovation that's going to help get us to the next level.
Yeah. We started Fire Wipes about just over 9 years ago. And honestly, what had the short story of is we left a fire, caught a trauma call, rode into the hospital. We're cleaning off in the sink, and we're getting screamed at by the hospital staff by making a big mess. Understandable. And they were blown away that we didn't have anything to clean ourselves after these fires. So I was riding on a truck that's up all night. I'm Googling things, and there were things that were on the market. There was 2 around at the time. And I immediately ordered them because I was teaching there. I was riding the truck, teaching at the academy, teaching at the college, frequently during these training fires. And honestly, the thing that really led us to push forward was the fail points in these. There was things that, if you look at categorically, there was challenges of alcohol, solvents, drying agents, high oil content that was affecting everything from the user's eyes, the taste of metal, the mask seal itself, gumming up the regulator. And when I called these companies to get clarification about the stuff that was being marketed to us, they didn't even know what an SCBA was. So my frustration, I use it as fuel. There's probably a better word for that, but I do. And it pushes me forward. And it really just catapulted me into this research and idea, and that really understanding a lot of the industry that sells to the fire department has never been a firefighter. They don't truly understand the environment we work in, and they don't understand the layers to this. And so, for example, these are all FDA approved, and that's great. But what is the intended use? It's not just on your hands and your arms. We're going to put it on our face, our mask. We're going to put that back on our face, reentry, training, overhaul. So now you're inhaling it, you're ingesting it, it's messing with your eyes. So there was a large overview of this that really pushed us into this, to doing a major R&D project into it. We came up with the formula. We've been, we like to say very successful. We've been sponsoring the HOTS at FDIC, places all over the country. But really, I think the thing for me is being the firefighter piece of this company, because I do have a business partner and he's not a firefighter, thank God, because I would have drove this right into the ground. I've learned a lot. But with that being said, translating it to how we're using it and having that practical approach, because we can have the best idea, but if it's not practical, it's not repeatable, then it's really not the answer. And really, coming from a hazmat background, I've told people the reason we have IDLH and the reason why we have even level A suits, there is still exposure. So what is the realistic approach to this? There's no zero out in hazmat, and we're in a bubble. There's not going to be a zero out on the fire ground, but how can we stop it? How can we minimize it? How can we be smarter? I absolutely agree. We took the oath. I take that very seriously, them before us. But that doesn't mean we need to be reckless, because them before us isn't on one call. It's every call for 30 years. And to me, that's what makes really great firefighters. So when that time comes, you have very seasoned and experienced firefighters. And if we're just throwing them away on very low-hanging fruit that we can just be better at, or have a better leadership, or just be more disciplined at, then that to me is the right way. So I tell people, just be smart. Flip these things over. I'm a Ford manufacturer, so of course I'm going to tell you Chevy's not great. But don't believe that. Do your own research, figure these things out. But there is safety categories that I do tell people is if there's alcohol, drying agents, solvents, things like that, well, those are bad for us in our gear. And if it's not safe for you, your mask, your tick camera, or your radio, then you probably need to take a better look at what you're using. But again, like we said, is taking the information, taking the research and applying it to your area, making the best decisions possible, I think is the way. We do that in tactics every day. So why wouldn't we do it in this arena as well?
Yeah, I'm going to steal a line from Frank. Well, a lot of those things you just mentioned, they're only hazardous in California. So everywhere else in this world, we're okay to use. So we're okay.
The bark beetles are safe.
Yeah. So I think this is a good spot, Creston, not to move away from what we're talking about, but to incorporate Dave Lenart. And one of the reasons we brought him on today to talk about volunteer command, which we can absolutely incorporate, like the command post in a volunteer agency and in the career departments as well. But we're talking about volunteer command posts on now having compliance, right? We can put all these policies and procedures in place and buy all these fancy toys and equipment, but it still comes down to the leadership and the men and women standing at the command posts to make sure we follow through on that stuff as well. So Dave, let's look at this. What's your concept and what's your thought process about this volunteer command program, and how do you see it parlaying with firefighter decon?
Well, it's like you said, it's education. Unfortunately, a lot of fire chiefs in the volunteer side of things, they don't get the needed education as to the importance of decon. It's kind of something that's always an afterthought. It's another line item in a budget. Sometimes the best they do is throw a couple of cases of baby wipes at you and say, "Oh, just tell the guys to go over in the corner after a fire and wipe themselves down, and they're good to go." Fortunately, I know around here, my fire commissioner, Gary Parker, I know most of you guys, the Connecticut guys know him very well. He's very well respected here. He's very knowledgeable on the cancer issue. So it was a priority for him to ensure that, gear decon was a thing, gross decon had a call. Each station had a washer in it. We were able to actually get a couple grants from our local community to put a washer at each of the fire stations. So it wasn't, we mentioned cost earlier, but it wasn't insurmountable to get just the basics, if you will. And again, Connecticut, we have the cancer bill. So we do have policy. It was coming into play just as my term was expiring. So I wasn't able to see it completely through. But it's the little steps like that. And like you mentioned, it starts at the top. And fortunately, me as fire chief, I always had a great guy like Gary ahead of me who, as the commissioner of the department, would push it down onto everybody. And it's all about the leadership. It's about if it's important to the chief and to the department, it'll be important to the members.
So I got to sidetrack this for a second. So what you're saying is if the Connecticut Fire Academy and all state academies should have a regional guidance program that we assist you in training your memberships and give you equipment and training to actually do that. That would be helpful, right?
Absolutely. There's a lot of little regional programs that the Connecticut Fire Academy could have to help the volunteer members like that.
Well, I need to hear more about those because that's one of my projects for 24 going into 25 for a statewide decon program. That's a handoff program to all departments across the state. So hopefully, we together we can pull something like that off. Frank?
Hopefully your decon problem is better than the Homeland Security trailers that were designed for Arizona. In the winter, every pipe would break in them. I mean, so David, you put together this program because you've seen a need, because you have volunteers coming up, and here now they find themselves in a command role. So kind of explain what your thought process is and where you're going with the volunteer command post.
Yeah, so, working in the city, working in a bigger city, you get to a job and what do you have, right? You have a robust command post. Battalion chiefs have aides, multiple chiefs respond. You have the training division, you have the office staff, the head chief of the department, the aides, different people showing up, and they're plugging holes in the command structure, and they're handling tasks, they're out there getting involved in operations. And then I would come home from work and go to a fire, and it was like the command post would usually just be a chief sitting in their car, sitting on the hood of their car. It wasn't formally established. And I started thinking to myself, like, why are we not doing this on the volunteer side? Why are we still relying on one guy to talk to both the dispatcher and the handle the fireground communications? So I started having a conversation with one of the guys from work, Mark Cody, he was a chief's aide at the time for Chief Thode, and he was probably our best, command post runner, if you will, commander as a lieutenant. And we created a short program that we delivered to the department so that the officers had a little understanding of what the expectation was while they were manning the command post. And then from there, I got involved in a regional fire conference with one of my friends who was in that. He says, I really think you're onto something. So we created the volunteer command post program, and it's not forever. It's a 3-hour program, but it goes over the importance of practically staffing and managing an incident using a command post and really getting into, I hate to say the stuff that we should be doing anyways, but really getting into it. And it's been very successful. I broke off with a podcast. The studio's under construction here. It's something I've become passionate about.
So can the fire tell the difference between a volunteer command post and a career command post, or does
No? It's something that we always say, right? Like you go to fires in one city, you go to fires in the other, the same fire. There's no stop sign at the door. There's no hold on timeout. These guys are just volunteers. So it's worked. That's the thing, is that if you look in our area now, if you look in what we call the Valley, for the out-of-stater, you see a lot of times now when the towns in the Valley are getting fires, the command post has become exactly that. It's the command post. The command board is set up. The officers are coming in. They're checking in. Assignments are being out. It's breaking away from that. I think the biggest part is that you've got the incident commander now finally focused on just the incident, and they're not worrying about, as we all know from running fires, dispatch is calling you saying, hey, you want this engine to go cover here, or where do you want to backfill from? And realistically, when you got guys in the building working, you don't care where you're getting a mutual aid engine from to go cover a firehouse. You worry about the members that are in the IDLH. And bringing in an officer or bringing in another member to handle that, just one task of splitting up the radio traffic between fireground communications and dispatch channel is massive. And I think we know a lot of that comes from my experience, obviously, with the Elmwood Ave fire in Bridgeport in 2010 when we lost Steve and Mitch. That was one of the things, is that there was just so much radio traffic between the command post and the incident commander that messages got lost.
Well, yes, we do a lot of talking, not a lot of communicating on the radio live, right, PJ?
Yeah, and I would have to think Creston's probably sitting here thinking, what are they talking about? Because coming from Phoenix, and and I'm not sure if Phoenix Fire uses Blue Card or not, but that area,
no, we don't have enough time. Don't do that.
Nope, that area of the country is a very different environment when you start looking at command and control of incidents the way that it's done here in Connecticut. And I have to tell you, the more I travel and talk and speak and listen, we are really behind in this New England area of how we run our incidents. It still works. We still get there. But, like Dave, you just mentioned, there are a lot of problems with some of the ways that we command incidents. And I know we're not going to change that. We're not going to see that change. But slowly through places like you and in the area of the Valley, making those changes and, new leadership coming up the ranks, we're starting to see, even in my small department, significant changes in the last 10 years, even the last 5 years of how we run incidents. So we're slowly getting to where I think that we should be.
I do have something to add to that.
I think we're absolutely going to get there. And I'll go to Creston next, but what do you call it? In Phoenix, I can assume that everybody kind of has a role and responsibility. And I think in New England and elsewhere in a lot of places in the country, it's not a lack of personnel. It's a lack of leadership to assign the personnel. Like Anthony Avillo said, when you have all these chiefs coming into your fire, break up the opinion brigade and increase your span of control and give them assignment, give them a radio designation and who reports to them, and start managing your fire. Because if they're all these chiefs standing around at your command post, the only thing they're doing is critiquing your operation when they could be making your operation that much better. Creston, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I would say that starting off at Rural Metro early in my career, we had a lot of work and not a lot of resources. And transferring to Phoenix, that really blew my mind on the fact that for us, so many departments in the automatic aid. This past summer, we had a 6-alarm fire, and nobody's worried about, on the incident anyway, where these backfills are coming from. We asked for it. The most important incident that we're on is that one. So everything else is being managed. But when I'm learning and traveling and working with firefighters, we're talking about span of control, utilizing the incident command system, having assignments and in designations that if that chief is standing there, have him get you a 360. Can he get his eyes on the back of the house because there are crews that are managing? Can he tell you have a walkout basement, something you are unaware of? So we can turn unknowns into knowns really fast by assigning these. But for us, we do, our chiefs do lock themselves in the truck and eventually under large enough incidents do transfer the command van. But having that isolated area for us, not only for weather issues, but just like you said, we are heavy on opinions and light on resources sometimes, or light on equipment. And I think that being able to have that person, if you need a senior advisor because it's a very complicated thing, great. Let that incident commander continue to drive it. They know what's going on. They know where people are at. We continue to advise them with our senior advisors. Fantastic.
PJ, I gotta jump in here because we have listeners here. We have chiefs that listen to this. When you say the word senior advisor, I think that a chief officer coming in and declaring over the radio that they're going to be senior advisor and stand next to that volunteer chief or career chief is so critical for mentoring. However, if you do that as a chief, that means you cannot talk on the radio, and that means you can't give orders, especially orders that contradict the chief you're supposed to be mentoring. You have to shut up and kind of whisper to that officer. And if, God forbid, the whole sky is falling and things are escalating behind control, you have the ability to transfer command to yourself. But that really means you failed as a mentor, because I could stand next to a chief and whisper the whole fire out, even if it was a 10th grader. So use the opportunity to build your personnel and kind of whisper them. And then if it's escalating and you need to put that person in an interior division or something, then of course transfer command. But don't say you're going to be the senior advisor in a paid role or volunteer role and then undermine your chief below you. It just doesn't work. PJ? Yeah,
Frank, I couldn't agree more. And I have, like, Creston said, opinions. Of course, we all know that I have a lot of opinions. And this is just an opinion that I hope that if I say it enough, somebody will hear it. Somebody that's much more intelligent than I am, and we could assign it to a bunch of interns and figure out if it's true or not. I think when you start looking at NIOSH line of duty death reports, we see this terminology of rapid fire development quite often in our NIOSH reports. But I have an opinion that truly only occurs in departments where the command structure is the way we in Connecticut command fire, standing on the front lawn. I don't think we're seeing that rapid fire development be listed in NIOSH reports in departments that are commanding from the vehicle. Now, I don't think I could ever command a fire from a vehicle. Let me throw that out there as well. However, when you command incidents like we have, all of us from the front lawn, we miss things. We can't see everything that's going on, and we may miss that rapid fire development where an incident commander who's sitting in the air-conditioned or heated vehicle, reclined, nice and comfortable, managing the radios, I think they see those changes in the fire grounds. And I think there's something that we should be looking at there at a national level to see if their NIOSH line of duty deaths are being reported in this rapid fire development based on the command structure.
I would say, when you talked about being able to see that and communicate, for us, breaking that apart with the incident command system does help because people know their roles, they understand their lane. But I also think what you said about having that senior advisor standing over them, if you take over the incident, okay, that's a small loss for that company officer or chief officer that is now being overshadowed. I think the big loss is succession planning. What happens when you're not there and you've never given that person an at-bat? It's trying to move people through the majors and never giving them an at-bat. I mean, the minors before you take them to the majors, and they've never had an at-bat. And then yet the field constantly describes some of our chief officers as never having this opportunity, never commanded a fire, wasn't a captain very long, wasn't a battalion chief very long. We can say that all day long, but yet sometimes that's because those that were mentoring them overshadowed them so heavy that it never gave them the opportunity to grow and understand. And I think that's the bigger loss for organizations long term. So yeah, that's a small loss, but I think we need to pay a bigger attention to what are the ripple effects of these decisions long term.
David, do you talk about in your program the benefit of having a senior advisor? For example, you come from Bridgeport, you show up a little bit later, your experience is going to be vastly different than the chief that's there, unless you got like Louis Allo or somebody. But I mean, do you try to build your personnel to build them up to get them to the next level?
Yeah, it's one of the hardest parts of the volunteer department now too. I mean, there's a lot of hard parts, but the officers in our department, it's a yearly for the company officers. The chiefs are tested, which we're one of the few departments around where the volunteer chiefs actually take a test to obtain their positions. But the company officers are still elected, and you're dealing with people on a 1-year term. One of the things we instituted was we started doing, officer development before they actually sat in the seat, if you will. So the way that the departments work, the meetings happen November, December. They get elected. They start their term January 1st. We began bringing guys in before that to take some, officer development, assigning them senior mentors. And we even had a couple of officers that we had to pretty much pull aside and tell them, you're out of the game until we say you're in the game, because we just don't have the faith in your ability as a firefighter, as an officer. And I don't have the trust in you to command a scene. And that's a very difficult conversation to have with somebody. And especially again, on the volunteer side, when the person's not there, for money, they're there for a multitude of reasons that usually drives them out the door. But I think it also goes back to understanding the responsibility of the officer. And if a person's stepping up and saying, I want to be an officer, that they have to understand that that's more work, more time, and more dedication, which is going to include additional training and being assigned that mentor. One of the things we did with the command post was, I always say my father's the prime example of this. My dad joined the fire service in 1975. He's retired now. He's almost 70. When you get a fire, especially here in the Valley, and you turn around and look across the street, there's probably a dozen or so more of the senior members of the department, right? Guys that are still on the rolls. They're still, coming to every meeting. They still stand in the back of training, but they physically can't, do the job anymore. And those are the guys that we kind of have thrown into the chief's aide position. Because, again, like using my dad as the example, who's a good guy to have in a command post? A guy who's been a fireman for 40 years. He was a cop for 20 years. He has a lot of that experience. And bring those senior volunteers back into the fold. Get more kind of, try to squeeze a little bit more juice out of them before they go, and use those guys. Because it is, go back to Commissioner Parker. He's a structural engineer with the USAR team. You have a car that drives through a house and he shows up to just stand there. Hey, what do you think? You're much more knowledgeable in this, and you'd be a fool as an incident commander if you knew that you had someone on a scene that had more knowledge than you, and just because of rank, you didn't utilize that.
Yeah, and Dave, I think what some of the things that this comes down to is what you're talking about, and what Creston is what we've already mentioned: education on the mission and the role, right, and leadership. So how do you achieve that in the volunteer department? You kind of referenced you bring them in and do some training up front and before they're into those positions. How do you achieve that from the volunteer perspective?
I'd hire Frank Ricci a lot to come in and teach in Derby. That was one thing. It is. It's just a lot of education. The problem is where you lack experience because, again, the metropolis of Derby and its 5 square miles, we're doing 500-600 calls a year. Out of those, you're going to actually maybe 5 or so fires. So you've got to make up for that lack of experience with training, and that's the best way to do it. And again, we always would bring people in. I would always bring in what I would always say heavy hitters, right? Your Rich Thodes, your Nick Espositos, guys like that who have a very good understanding of the system. They've done both volunteer and career work, and they hold the members' attention. Because I could stand up there all day and teach, and as much as my credentials are well, I'm still David that grew up with everyone, and someone's throwing a paper airplane in the back. But when I bring in, an outside guy who they don't know but's got the credit, it also draws a lot of attention to that. And I think that's a great way to do it, and it's relatively inexpensive.
And I'm going to turn to Frank, but just to comment on that, I couldn't agree more. And it could be your PowerPoint and your lesson plan, but if you have somebody else teach it, it automatically elevates it to another level. Even if it's somebody from a neighboring department, if it's not your voice, even though it's your content, it totally changes the game. Frank?
Creston, I want to ask you a question because Phoenix and Alan Brunacini was always, top notch when it came to command. Is Phoenix still doing those command simulations before you become a command officer where you're sitting through the car looking at the screen? Can you explain a little bit about that? Because I think Connecticut could do a much better job than that. I know Frederick County, Maryland, after a basement fire death and they did the NIOSH report, they actually hired a civilian to run their command competency program for career and volunteer firefighters to get checked off before they have to command a fire in the car, and they operate in the car like Phoenix does. Can you explain Phoenix's system?
Absolutely. It's called the CTC, the Command Training Center. It is a division of our fire department. It has a division chief, which is a 40-hour battalion chief that runs it, and he has a slew of staff over there. We run simulations on the computers. We run simulations actually sitting in BC trucks. They have a simulation where you're sitting in the command van, where they will take every level of officer development. When you're trying to become a captain, they have classes for you to be taking. So you're sitting in those roles, having those discussions, working through structure fires, commercial fires. We've even gotten into like large scale, 2-in-1 medicals, extensive triage reports that we're utilizing, especially the ramp triage. We've now adopted that. And we're doing that training currently. So violent incident, mass casualty, everything you would ever need under the idea, because our folks were pretty good at fires, but you go to a multi-vehicle accident and people were having a hard time of what they were going to say, including special operations, because whoever's there first, it doesn't matter if it's an AMBO, which we call rescues, has to take command. That happened last night on a car ped situation we dealt with. The ambulance was there first. Our rescue guys were there. They did a great job, but young members that really did a good job for their very first time. This allows us to go back on every level. We do crew simulations there, so it's not just the captains and chief officers. We do them the most regular. We break them apart. The last one we did recently, you actually are in the hot seat. There was 5 stations, and you're the only person sitting in the room with the proctor. Because we do group simulations where we're all working together. That's great. And then we were doing individual rooms where you are watching it on the TV or the computer screen and giving your radio traffic. So it's not just talking about it. You are talking on the radio, giving reports. And for those that are new within their position or newer on the job, are being coached. And they have that senior advisor type person over their shoulder helping them see, if you're going to say it the first time, say it right. As you get more experience in your years through, great, the training wheels come off, that crawl, walk, run approach to any type of training. But one of the things I think we're also doing that's helping us quite a bit is the incident command system, critical fireground factors, all those things that Chief Brunacini developed, is we're starting to just distill that back down from the firefighter and engineer levels, because they have different things they're looking at and considering. And as they're evolving through the organization, obviously progressing through their positions in the ranks, that allows them, it actually gives them a base of understanding, and then you're giving them a little bit more. Instead of the first time you're thinking about incident command, the first time you're thinking about critical unknowns is when you become a captain. And for us, that's a lot to take on for anybody to change their mindset. So I think it's been very helpful doing the crew simulations and breaking these things down from the firefighter and engineer perspective before they ever have the opportunity to become a captain.
David, are you guys utilizing tactical workshops, tactical worksheets in your program? Or is there like a board?
Yeah, we it's actually, I took the assistant chief's test. I passed. I came home the next day. I said, okay, I'm going to be a chief. We had nothing. So I sat down on, Microsoft Publisher, I think it was at the time, and Googled a couple and tailor-made one. So I use those. And then we also have, we use I don't remember the actual name of the company, but we use the standardized command board that all of us use up here in New England now with the magnetic top. And what we did in Bridgeport was Pete Morado. There's one of the members, Ryan Hathaway. He owns a window tinting business on the side, and he actually made vinyl tops. So when you instead of drawing scenes out, you now have a selection of pre-made. There's a 2.5 wood, a 3 wood, a high rise that you can just slap down right on the command board as soon as you get there, with all the information ready to be filled in or pre-filled in based on the type of incident. And I utilize those a lot during the program. The nice thing is most classrooms do have a dry erase board somewhere, so you can just slap it on the wall and start using them.
So you'll be writing an article for fire engineering on numbers and these plug and play.
I feel like we both got roped into that one today.
Dave, and something like that, I'd be willing to help you from an education standpoint, because one thing that we've changed here at the Connecticut Fire Academy with our Fire Officer 1 program, as you're aware, all the Fire Officer 1 candidates come through the academy and go through a simulation day. Well, what I noticed, and when I first came to the academy, I'd pop in the sim room, and the officer sitting at a table, just kind of hanging out, relaxing, and walking through the simulation. So now there's no table, there's no chairs, there's a command board, there's a radio microphone. We've darkened out the windows. We've turned the lighting way down in the room. We have a large screen now, and we make that officer candidate stand like he or she would at a command post, at a command board, right, to go through the simulation. Says, we're not training incident commanders. We sit in a recliner at a fire. We're training them to stand up at a command post and have that command presence. So we're going to do that from the academy perspective. So it'd be good to chat further with you on that. When you start that article, I'd be happy to contribute to it.
Great. Thank you.
I think one of the things we need, at least in New England on the command board, because I'm a big believer in it, is we need one of those dog leashes, the retractable one, so the chief can only go like 5 feet and then
5 feet off. Yeah.
Because if they want to see something, assign somebody a division to go look at it and report, or a group, because the command post is no good if nobody's at it. And New Haven's come a long way. We had no incident command when I first got there. Now they use incident command, divisions, groups, EMS branches. They're doing a great job. But my last fire in New Haven, I showed up from home at a 2-alarm fire, went up to the command board, nobody was there, and I wrote car 81 here on the board because nobody was at the command post. So we got to make sure that we use these tools, because that's one of the disadvantages to being out front of the building. A lot of good officers get distracted and they move. And now when somebody needs to find somebody at the command post for a face-to-face, they're not there. David, we're at the witching hour here. You want to wrap it up? Feel free to plug your podcast and what you're doing with volunteers at the command post.
Yeah, so the name of the podcast is The Volley Chief. You can find it on all the big podcast platforms, on Spotify, on Apple. I'm sure I've got the listener count in the tens by now, so it's pretty good. But
the only people watching today are PJ's mom and mine. So
well, I was just going to say it's the best podcast my mom ever listened to. But no, and I thank you for the opportunity today. If you have any other questions, just shoot me an email. I did want to mention one thing, and that I'm now the second member of my family to be involved with a little bit of fire engineering. In 1925. There was an article written, ironically, by the deputy chief of the Bridgeport Fire Department about my great-grandfather when he was fire chief, and how, as a small-town fire chief, he would go around and make sure exits were clear and kind of do fire marshaling. So I'm excited to be here to keep the legacy going.
David, do you have a copy?
I do. Actually, yeah, I do have a copy of it.
Excellent. What a great memento. And now, Frank teed up that softball to you. So now hopefully you get that article done and you can be published in the same traditional magazine that's grown so much since that day.
And David, if you email me the year and the name of the edition, I could probably get Mark to put a link up, because I believe Fire Engineer has most of them digitized now. So it's an honor to have you on. And when you said Derby's only 5 square miles, that puts like an impression in people's mind. But I could tell you, Derby's got a great culture. They're a great fire department. As a city guy, when I used to go there, everybody's engaged and they get some really good, they may not be as many, but they get some really good fires in 2.5 boom frame, 3-story brace frame structures each year. So you're a credit to that department in Bridgeport. Creston, last words for today?
Take ownership of the culture and the message. I share this story that when I first started volunteering at 15, I had a senior firefighter tell me, by becoming a fireman, you would take 7 years off your life. And I didn't blink, because at the time I was thinking, well, from 100 to 93 is not that bad. But the reality is it's 50 to 43. It's 40 to 33. So just know what's really at risk, and that we can be better. And that if we can be as hard charging against cancer as we are on the hose line, then we'd probably be in a better place all around.
Excellent.
Very well said. PJ, last words for today?
Oh, just Frank, as always, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be your co-host. As always, we love to have Mark in the background, who doesn't like to come on camera, but we appreciate all the work that he does. And thanks to David and Diane and Dana for getting me safely to and from FDIC to spend a great week with a lot of friends and a lot of new friends. So thank you.
All right, that's it for Politics and Tactics today. Everybody have a great day. Mark, take us off.